How can history help us understand the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Why can Moscow not even imagine itself without Kyiv? Is Russia an empire in decline? You're listening to the Explaining Ukraine podcast. Explaining Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Professor Serhii Plokhii, a prominent Ukrainian historian, director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and author of numerous books about Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe. His latest book is The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History. This conversation was held in Kyiv on May 24th, 2024, before Plokhii met with the Ukrainian public at the UkraineWorld Club and PEN Ukraine. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines of this war at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. I also invite you to check two other UkraineWorld podcasts with Serhii Plokhii. You will also find these links in the description. So, let's start. Serhii Plokhii, welcome to this podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And we are talking in Kyiv. And for our listeners, I will say that we have two other episodes with Serhii Plokhii, one about Ukrainian history and a recent one about the Second World War. But we are today in Kyiv. This is the end of May 2024. And I would like to talk with you about the war, obviously, but the historical context of this war. So you're writing a lot about it. You just published a book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History. So why do you think that history came back?
First of all, I want to say that this is not a dig at Francis Fukuyama. It's more a reaction to my own thinking, and I believe thinking the majority of people whom I met in the last 10 to 15 years. There was maybe not articulated, not fully verbalized, thinking that the horrors of the 20th century are behind us, that the world somehow changed, if not in terms of the victory of the liberal democracy, the way how at least one of the approaches that Francis Fukuyama had, but in terms of the brutality of the war. And there were these reasons to think in those terms because the Soviet Union, successor to the territorially largest world empire, disintegrated without a major war. It looked like the old rules didn't apply anymore, that democracy could be achieved by people going and voting. And really what mattered was the will of the people, expressed through different forms, but basically non-violent forms. And it turned out that the history of the 20th century didn't end. I call in my book this war the 19th century war in terms of ideology and ideas, 20th century war in terms of tactics, and 21st century war in terms of new technologies. It really changes the face of the war, especially the face of the war on the sea. So the return of history, it is about the return of a sort of the xenophobia, a sort of nationalism, isolationism, aggression, territorial acquisitions that we saw back in the 1930s. And we studied that as a historical subject. And I and probably other historians somehow believed that, because we dealt with that all the time, that somehow the humanity as a whole either knew that or somehow learned lessons from that. There was a belief that that history not only doesn't repeat itself, but also rarely rhymes. And the all-out war that started in 2022 put the entire period after the fall of the Berlin Wall in very different perspective. It turned out to be that what started there with 1989 and revolutions in Eastern Europe with 1989 was a particular period of history that had not only its beginning but also had its end, and we now see and we live through this end. That was not really the dawn of the new era that would last almost forever. But that feeling of the 1989 lasting almost forever was, in my opinion, in my understanding, part of our thinking, sitting somewhere in the background. Again, maybe not verbalized. So that is what I had in mind when I put this subtitle.
It really rhymes with my thinking as a philosopher, not a historian, because I also am writing right now. We're writing a book about the war with my wife, and there is a chapter on return of history. And it's not also about Francis Fukuyama, because I think that major European thinking of the post-Second World War was already about that history is in the past, that we can also be in the regime of memory. So there can be a struggle of memory, but all the horrible things are in the past. And I think that was a deep illusion. Let me ask you about Russia, obviously, because you are an author of brilliant history of Ukraine, The Gates of Europe, but you're also an author of this ideological deconstruction of the Russian ideology. I mean, deconstruction of Russian ideology in the Lost Kingdom. Can we describe Russia as a declining empire? If yes, do we have any guarantee that this is a really declining empire? Because we had in the past the moments of Russian imperial decline. I mean, 1917, 1991, maybe some other dates that you might suggest. And we see Russia's capacity to reinvent itself as an empire. And this is, in my opinion, this is what differentiates it with European empires that collapsed, and that's it. What do you think?
People normally forget that the Russian Empire fell apart. We will look at the history of 1916, 1917, 1918 through the history of the 1920s and 1930s when the Soviet Union was already there. The Bolsheviks stitched that empire together and were able then to expand its reach and expand its territory. They stitched it together through the use of the brutal force, and we know that. But they also stitched it together by making concessions to nationalism as a principle. So the creation of the Soviet Union, certainly recognition of principle of nationalism as the way to organize this new multi-ethnic state. The way how the borders are moved, it's also very interesting. They take into account, or they're even based on the principle of nationality, because we talk about Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There are two Molotov-Ribbentrop pacts and documents, one signed in August, another in September. And in August, the model of territorial division was an imperial one produced by Germany on the basis of the basically historical maps, in which Warsaw, part of Poland that belonged to the Russian Empire, was supposed to go to the Bolsheviks. And Stalin, in excitement, signed this document, and then in September changed his mind and exchanged part of Poland that went to the Soviet Union for Lithuania. So the principle was that you don't take over chunks of the territory, and you drew imperial borders according to the to the borders of national state, which also contributed to the stability of that entity, stability of that empire. But again, the decline, which was more like a defeat in the result of defeat of World War I, was really very short-lived, because the Bolsheviks realized the dream of the Tsars, reuniting, quote unquote, the lands of the Kievan Rus. So the Transcarpathia was the last. It was the so to speak, the vision of the reunification of Russia that was formulated almost in late medieval period came to the fruition with taking over Uzhhorod and
even Galicia
and Mukachevo.
yeah? Even Galicia
and Galicia before that. The Tsars got already to Galicia and claimed it in 1914 and early 1915, and the Soviets actually exceeded that. So really, the short period of crisis really precipitated a major rise of the Soviet Union, creating also a huge sphere of influence, the so-called Outer Empire. That is one way to look at that. But the fact that I just mentioned, that the empire was built also on a little bit different principles of principle of nationality, meant that Poland somehow stayed already out of the Soviet Union. Finland, the former possession, stayed also outside of the Soviet Union, and more than that, was not even run by the Communist Party. So what we see that if in certain cases there is annexation of the territory, in others there is a process of actually letting these countries go with a maybe limited sovereignty at the beginning, but generally that is what is happening. And in that sense, that's the parallel process is also the process of continuing disintegration of empire. It's very complex, it's very difficult to understand, but there is a growth and there is also letting the empire go. The explanation is through the nationalism. The growth is by bringing in the Ukrainian territories. The loss comes as the result of letting other groups to have their sovereignty, again, limited or less limited, like in case with Finland. So the process of disintegration of empire from that point of view, driven by the principle of nationalism, never stopped even at the time of the territorial growth of the Soviet Union, and that's trajectory that certainly became dominant in the late 1980s with the loss of the Baltic states, and Estonia declares independence already in March of 1990. Ukraine follows in 91, and really Russia struggles today to bring back that territory in some form under its control. I think it is a classic case of a decline in empire.
Can we say that, so you're describing a process when Russia, by trying to keep some territory, and in the 20th century it was primarily Ukraine, like if we speak in big terms, and it let go Poland. And the big question of the 20th century is the Polish question, because the Polish national movement was so much important in the 19th century, much more visible than Ukrainian national movement. In a way, Ukrainian national movement was, I would not say copying, but going after the Polish national movement. Even our anthem kind of rhymes with Polish national anthem. The idea of regenerated nation is also in Ukrainian romanticism, goes hand in hand with the Polish romanticism. And the key elements of the Ukrainian history in the 19th century are related somehow with Polish uprisings in the 30s and the 60s of the 19th century. And finally, Poland gets its independence in early 20th century. Ukraine does not. And we had a recently podcast with a wonderful historian Larry Wolff from New York University, and I was quoting his book about Woodrow Wilson. When Woodrow Wilson was asked, "What do you think about Ruthenians?" he said, "Probably something is going on about Ruthenians, but I don't remember what exactly." Right, so it was completely out of the mental map of the big leader who basically drew the map of the Central and Eastern Europe. can we say that the role which was played by Poland in the 20th century is now played by Ukraine? Because what we see is how, for example, Russian culture, Russian imperial culture, Russian literature was reacting to the Polish question. Even such people as Pushkin and Dostoevsky, they are now reacting to the Ukrainian question. So they were saying, okay, these are our Slavs, we can do with them whatever we want, don't intervene in our, crushing of Polish uprising. And now they're saying the same about Ukrainians. Can we draw this parallel?
Yes, we can, and it's really very easy to do. It's also a very productive comparison. What we see in the 20th century after the formation of the Soviet Union is that Ukrainians literally replace the Poles as the major troublemaker in the empire. Because the Polish troublemaking came not just with the two armed uprisings in the 19th century. It came also with bringing of idea of nation and nationalism. The Russian term "narodnost" is based or copied on "narodovość," so that they were not only Ukrainians, as you said, copying or reacted to what was happening in Poland, but Russians were doing that as well. So it was a huge headache, and that was one of the reasons also why Stalin decided to renegotiate the original Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Ukrainians became the largest minority in the Soviet Union, the second largest republic after Russia. And Ukraine turned out to be not strong enough. The Ukrainian national movement was not strong enough. Ukraine was not mobilized enough not to keep the independence that was declared more than once. But it was eventually lost. But being weak to keep independent, the national movement was strong enough for the Soviets really to model their entire nationality policy on Ukraine and Ukrainians. That was the major challenge. This is at least the argument that I share with my colleague at Harvard, Terry Martin. So Ukrainians are the poles when it comes to Russia-run multi-ethnic states. The Ukrainians are in 20th century are what the Poles were back in the 19th century. And if you even look at the way how the Soviet Union falls apart in 1991, I already mentioned that Lithuanians are the first to declare their independence in March of 1990, before Estonians and before Latvians. And Lithuania, it's again another in many ways a product of the interaction with Poland and Polish history and Polish nationalism, which also meant that what was happening in Poland with Solidarność and so on and so forth had a very strong impact in Lithuania. And what was happening in Lithuania had a strong impact on Ruch and the activists of the Ukrainian independent movement here. You're almost forced to go back to the thinking about the space in terms of the borders, including cultural borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Suddenly, these borders appeared from beneath, out of nowhere, and became a very important factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union, with Lithuanians leading the way and Ukrainians put in the final blow to the empire in the form in which existed in 91.
You mentioned an amazing fact in your book that Ukrainians were the only to hold the referendum, right? So basically, Ukrainians were not voting for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukrainians were voting for their own independence. And even in Crimea, it was a majority. In Donbass, it was a majority. And in the whole of Ukraine, it was an overwhelming majority. So this sole vote put an end to the whole Soviet Union. Why?
Yes. First, I would like to correct myself. Also, I really said that or wrote that without right qualifiers. So the only to have the referendum in the wake of the failed coup in Moscow, and when you look at Russia or Belarus, the countries that together with Ukraine dissolved the Soviet Union, Ukrainians were the only ones. But there were earlier on some referendums as well, with not the level of impact that Ukrainian referendum had in 1991, or not the level of impact that Declaration of Ukrainian Independence had in August of 1991. And why Ukraine was the impact was so strong. One reason is just a pure size, not territorial size, but economic potential and population. The second largest Soviet republic. The second one was that the Ukrainian referendum or the Ukrainian vote for independence in August of 1991 was mostly produced by the members of the parliament who at least nominally were the members of the Communist Party. So it's where the communist majority, the split or shifts and votes for independence, which provided the route toward independence for Central Asian and other countries where the communists were still in majority. And that was another channel through which Ukrainian independence, in terms of model of how it was declared, impacted the rest of the Soviet Union. So it would be not exaggeration, or maybe only slight exaggeration, to say that the Soviet Union was very much built around Ukraine, accommodating now the pushback from the Ukrainian communist elites against centralization conducted by Stalin. I say slightly exaggeration because Ukrainians were not the only ones. There were other troublemakers, the Georgians. So Georgians and Ukrainians, that's the story that leads Lenin to push back against Stalin, and instead of the Russian Federation, create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And certainly when you look at 1991, Ukrainian referendum is extremely important, but qualifier is that the Lithuanian independence, Declaration of Independence, is at least equally important.
So Ukrainians were a decisive force in the collapse of the Soviet Union, but we can also say that they were a decisive force in the creation of the Soviet Union in its quasi-federation form. And probably this is why Putin hates so much Lenin and tells the story that Lenin invented Ukrainians. I was surprised when I have heard his interview in early 90s when he was a deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and somehow there was an interview with him. He was saying the same things. So he didn't change for all the time. So he reproached to Lenin the kind of ruining the unitary idea of the Russian Empire. But when we come back to the Ukrainian political thinking in the 19th century, we see Kostomarov, Mykola Kostomarov, the romantic historian, who presents the idea of a federation of Slavic people. And then we see Drahomanov, who is completely different ideologically, not romantic at all, much more positivist and scientist, but who presents the same idea. So I would say that Ukrainians were taking this romantic idea of Republic of Nations, which was very popular around 1848, and then trying to apply this to the Russian Empire. And of course, what they created was not at all what they dreamed about. But this can explain how all these efforts of Ukrainians, even in the UNR, Ukrainian People's Republic, they were so much cautious about proclaiming independence. They were still believing that you can create something like European Union out of the Russian Empire. What do you think about this?
Yes, federalist idea and autonomist ideas were very important for the rise of modern Ukrainian national project. That they're foundational. That comes, of course, with Mykola Kostomarov and books of Genesis of Ukrainian people, and then that continues all the way into the early 20th century, where people who pushed for independence, like Mikhnovsky, they were really, really marginal forces in on Ukrainian political stage. The key figures were federalists, and if you read the Fourth Universal Declaration of Ukrainian Independence, you can have a number of interpretations of it, but when I read it, I almost see it as an excuse and explanation of why we should declare independence. It's almost between the lines is that, well, we don't think or didn't think that was a good idea, but we are pushed.
We tried so hard to check all other options.
Right, and Russia started war on us, and so on and so forth, and it pushed us, and now we have no other choice, which means not only, at least in my mind, that they're trying to appeal to the broader public for whom the idea of independence is not a household kind of concept that they consider to be fully legitimate, but that they're also addressing themselves.
So we are talking, for our listeners, we're talking about 1918 or 18.
Yeah, we are talking about the January of 19.
So it was long ago. It's not 18. This independence, it was previous one, yeah.
Yes. It is about 1918. And there is echo in 1991 as well, not on the same level, but basically the argument is that, well, our existence put under threat, existential threat by coup in Moscow, right? So again, they're dealing with the population for whom the decades of the Soviet propaganda, Russo-centric propaganda, made the word independence a dirty word.
You are a Ukrainian historian, Ukrainian-American historian, who is also digging into the history of Russia. And you're digging into this mythology of Rus, mythology of Russia. You wrote the wonderful book, The Lost Kingdom, but also other texts. And for me, it's obvious that there is something in this mythology that provokes this war. And we see that on Putin's historiosophy, I don't know how to call it, which basically draws the idea of continuity without any ruptures, continuity of the Russian, quote-unquote, Russian history from the medieval times until today. And this history, Kyiv is like a head or a heart of the Russian project. So if Russia is without Kyiv, in Putin's mind, it's like an acephal. It's a body without a head. Do you read this in the same way?
Putin is many things, but he's not an original thinker. What he is proposing has a long history of Russian imperial myth-making that was translated into transmitted to a degree into the post-1991 Russia by a Nobel laureate called Alexander Solzhenitsyn. His vision of he was not only the Russian nationalist who believed that Lenin and communism, they did horrible things to Russia, and that only if you remove communism, then Russia can really become a truly successful nation and country. But he is also the Russian nationalist of the 19th century vintage, where Russian nation for him is Eastern Slavs, big Russian nation of the 19th century, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and territories settled in Kazakhstan by also Eastern Slavs. So if he passes a test on the nationalism, and if nationalism, the definition is that it is the principle according to which the political border should coincide with the ethnic and cultural and linguistic. So if you approach that test to Solzhenitsyn, he passes it as the big Russian nationalist, because in his book 1990 that everyone read widely, and Putin certainly was influenced by it, and his entire generation who was lost faith in communism and was looking for another alternative. in this very popular and very influential text, How We Should Restructure Russia. He talks about restructuring Russia that would include Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. He doesn't call Ukrainians little Russians, but other than that, it's a classic imperial mythology, behind which is other works of the most influential Russian historian of the 19th and then 20th century, especially when it comes to Russian historiography in the US and abroad. This is Vasily Kluchevsky. For him, the entire theme, narrative, the idea of Russian history is reunification of Russian lands, right? To a degree, the same, in different ways, but the same theme is there in Kostomarov, in Solovyov, and so on and so forth. The really, really bizarre thing is that someone like Putin is taking this 19th century ideology and tries to, we're talking about rewriting history, unmake history to a degree. That, okay, the Soviet period was an aberration. So that's a very much Solzhenitsyn's idea. And then the way how you go about that, you're not including Uzbeks anymore into your state, but your nation state is the state of the 19th century Russian imperial nation. We talked about the way how imperial authorities treated Poland as troublemakers, and then that was transmitted toward Ukraine. Pushkin, Alexander Pushkin, another very important figure, not just Russian culture, but Russian imperial culture.
To the Slanderers of Russia, his basic text, where he, as if he speaks as a current Russian propagandist.
Yes, and think about his testament, «Я памятник себе воздвиг нерукотворный». You're getting there, Kalmyk and others, and all of them would be praising him as their poet. So, but he was the one who was basically, to the slanderers of Russia, was attacking the French and get out of way. This is the quarrel between Slavs. We'll figure it out.
And the warning that we can be again in Paris. So
right.
It's like we can repeat, right? The warning of today, можем повторить.
And you said that the Putin now talks in the same way about Ukraine, but between Pushkin and Putin, there was also another character. His name was General Anton Denikin. So in his memoirs, he basically applies this Putin's approach to Poland, to Ukraine, and then Putin already borrows it from Denikin.
So it's amazing. You mentioned Solzhenitsyn. It's amazing how many illusions the Western intellectuals had about Solzhenitsyn. Because I think that there's one thing they didn't understand, that for these Russian dissidents, they were seeking an alternative to the Soviet Union, and they were finding this alternative even more bigger imperial Russian project. While for Ukrainian dissidents, especially after the Helsinki movement, it was all about how to combine certain liberal nationalism, moderate nationalism, and the idea of human rights. So, of course, in Russia we have also liberal dissidents, but it seems that they're who produced Memorial and other very, very good and important initiatives, but it didn't grow into kind of a national movement as in Ukraine.
Yes, and you can just look at the composition of the Helsinki groups in Russia and in Ukraine. In Ukrainian Helsinki group, you can find someone who justly or unjustly was called Ukrainian nationalist. Certainly national ideology was very important there. But it was merged with the human rights ideology. There were not just ethnic Ukrainians, there were Jews, there were Russians and others. You look at the composition of the Helsinki group in Moscow, it's impossible to find one single Russian nationalist as part of this human rights movement. no matter what definition of nationalism you apply. And there is this thinking also about the Russian dissident movement as having two wings. One is liberal, and another is Russian nationalist, with Solzhenitsyn being the most recognizable representative of Russian nationalist, illiberal.
And interestingly, in Ukraine, these two wings combined. They combined into a certain, what we call national democracy, right? And this was an ideology of Narodny Ruch, more or less. And I would say that this was an ideology of Yushchenko and then Poroshenko and then even Zelensky, who actually has no idea of ideologies, I believe, but who adopted a kind of a mood that exists in the country. Let me ask a very interesting question, in which I'm asked as a philosopher quite often. How do we see the combination between the imperial and the national in the Russian project, the Russian political project? Because it also helps us better understand this war. If I tell you that Russian idea is to build an empire and to say this is not an empire, this is a nation, and how they do it by assimilation, they do it by eradicating differences. So they build an empire pretending it is a nation. Will you agree?
Yes, the general tendency is integration of the regions that originally are acquired on the basically on the basis of really broad autonomy. You look at the Ukrainian Hetmanate, right? The only place where the Cossack state survived. It didn't survive under Ottoman rule. It didn't survive under the Polish rule. It survived under the Russian rule because they were much better empire builders than their competition.
But there were, after the destruction of Sich in the 19th century, the famous Zaporozhye za Dunajem, right? So under the Ottoman rule, so they survived more than in the Russian Empire.
The Zaporozhian Sich and Zaporozhian group on Dunai was basically, let's say, not the most important. I'm trying to be very careful with the language, not to say marginal, but not very important thread within the Ukrainian Cossackdom. The Ukrainian Hetmanate was a state, when Zaporozhye Sich never was a state. So there was one Cossack state, which was called Hetmanate. I come from Zaporizhia. I have deep respect. I believe I have Cossack roots. But also I'm a historian, and I realize the difference between Zaporozhian Cossacks and Cossacks Poltava and the Hetman state. So the Hetman state as autonomous entity.
We're talking about the late 17th, early 18th century, right?
From mid 17th century into the last decade of the 18th century. It survived in the Russian Empire. But eventually it was integrated, right? Elites were integrated. And that's the story of Russia being very successful as an empire, which also meant giving special rights and privileges to different groups. But eventually that would turn out to be a stage. And then those elites would be integrated, and then, of course, through the cultural Russification. Army was a big Russifier. We think about universities and schools, and Russia was not doing there very well, but Russia was doing very well in terms of its military force. And Russia and Russian army was a big cultural Russifying force. So you really start as an empire, you move as an empire and acquire new territories. But then you integrate that into the core also into the cultural core. So the vision that nationalism and imperialism are necessarily at odds is basically a very one-sided approach. In the imperial case, again, it's difficult, there are tensions, but there are a lot of, unfortunately, very successful examples of nationalism enforcing imperialism and vice versa, and Russian case is one of those.
If we talk about the opposition to the empire, I think you also mentioned in your book Russo-Ukrainian War that Ukrainians were the biggest ethnic group in the Gulag. But at the same time, there are stories of this integration, elite integration. There were big Ukrainian figures in the establishment of the Russian Empire in the early 19th century. Even Ukrainians helped to suppress the Polish uprising, if I'm not mistaken, in the 30s. Earlier Ukrainians helped kind of in the Russian Empire war against the Crimean Khanate, and then the siege was destroyed when the Khanate was annexed. And there is also this famous Soviet Union where people talk about Dnipropetrovsk clan with Brezhnev and all the rest. So how to combine this? Because my response to that is that yes, there is a certain number of Ukrainians who are trying to integrate with the empire. We can even say, and in Lost Kingdom you showed it, that Ukrainian intellectuals or Kyiv intellectuals like Feofan Prokopovich and Stefan Yavorsky helped, imagine the concept of this empire through this idea of Rus and dynastial continuity, etc. So Ukrainians were not only the biggest troublemakers, but sometimes they were, co-builders. But for me, when they were co-builders of the empire, they kind of rejected the Ukrainian identity. They were choosing another one. Will you agree with that?
Partially would agree with that. Ukrainians are sometimes as empire builders for somebody else compared to Scots, right? So it's not particularly unique. Then also it's not unique that the ethnic group from outside, because it plays the game of politics as a team, right? When others are not united, they can really score in a major way, and non-core ethnic groups from the periphery rise into power in the center of empires. Again, you look at the Austro-Hungarians and Russian Empire, and you can look at other empires as well. This is not something unique. What becomes really unique is that Ukrainians, as you said, were also very much the first empire builders and nation builders in the cultural terms, for their own reasons. That's how they were legitimizing their maybe oversized role in the running of empire, or trying to get to the center of empire. And the text that eventually became the text symbolizing the rise of Ukrainian nationalism in the empire, called Historia Rusiv, the history of the Rus, coming from the first decades of the 19th century, was written paradoxically with the idea to improve the position of the Cossack elite in the Russian Empire. So this unique role of Ukrainians comes from the fact that Ukraine before Russia, on the level of educational level, cultural level, adopted certain models coming from the West, that then, after being transformed and really applied to the Slavic and Orthodox and East Christian background, were then exported or re-exported to Russia. Those who are interested in Russia know certainly about the old believers, that the so-called Raskol. Well, Raskol, it's a reaction of the traditional Russian church, Orthodox Church, to too much of Mohylian type of reforms.
And to people who said, let's read the books, let's check the books.
Yeah, yes. So again, many about Ukrainians being very important in the empire, it finds parallels with other groups, but unique role about Ukrainians that they were ahead of the Russian elites in terms of what was considered a new model of thinking, on intellectual level, on cultural level, on political level. It's Feofan Prokopovich who really formulates for Peter key ideas, basic ideas about Russian Empire, but also not only as an empire, but also as a Russian Empire.
That's amazing how basically Kyiv helped to create certain ideas that then appear to be existential danger for ourselves. So it's also a paradox of this history. But it's an interesting idea that basically Christianity came to those future Russian lands through Kyiv, then Reformed Orthodoxy came from here, then we can say that imperial thinking came from here, then maybe socialist thinking, nationalist certainly, we talked about this. So, and we see that how Russian ethnography in the 19th century was so much dependent on Ukrainian ethnography, on people like Maximovich and all the rest. Maybe socialism as well, but my question is when the liberalism will reach out to Russia, when the liberalist ideas will reach out, and that's to this we don't have an answer.
I remember reading in the 1990s that the fact that Ukraine, that created or helped to create the Commonwealth of Independent States, refused to join it, that there was a lot of regrets on the part of Belarusian leadership in Central Asia and others that Ukraine really was de facto outside of the Commonwealth, because they thought that with Ukraine they would be a much stronger force influencing Russia, negotiating with Russia, and so on and so forth. So the reality is that to influence the empire, you have to be conquered. You have to be part of that imperial elites. And Ukraine and Ukrainian elite in particular at some point said no, and decided not to be part of that imperial or post-imperial game. And now the only way how Ukraine can influence Russia is by example. The same way how the Polish nationalism influenced Ukrainian and then Russian nationalism, how the Polish path to independence, Polish path to NATO, to European structures inspire Ukrainians today. And there is an argument, very strong argument. I think it's a good one, that big part of this war, of this conflict, is also about successful Ukraine presenting a challenge to the legitimacy of authoritarian regime in Russia. Because if you state and you believe that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, what that means, if one part of the Russian people live in democracy and another doesn't, that sends a very powerful message, destabilizing message from the perspective of Kremlin. So that Ukraine, I think, continues to influence Russia and Russian politics very much, but in a different way, not from inside, not from bringing in the ideas, but trying to set an example of successful democratic country. And the Russian regime does everything in its power, launching the largest war in Europe since 1945 to stop that from happening.
Yes, because they have fear of it. They have fear that it will come into their lands. And we do hope that sooner or later it will come to these lands too. But the problem is that it's maybe a very long-term horizon. Serhii Plokhii, thank you so much for this incredible conversation.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for having me on podcast.
This was a podcast Explain Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld, and president of PAN Ukraine. My guest today was Serhii Plokhii, a prominent Ukrainian historian, director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and author of numerous books about Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe. Let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld, We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines of this war at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.